Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Scott Hessen. I'm an electrophysiologist with Cardiology Consultants of Philadelphia and Thomas Jefferson University, and one of the directors of CVI's EP Arrhythmia Management Education Programs Committee. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's CVI EP Arrhythmia Management webinar entitled Inspector Gadget, the Psychology of Living with Cardiac Disease and Cardiac Devices. Samuel Sears, PhD, is professor in the departments of both psychology and cardiovascular sciences at East Carolina University. He also serves as the director of doctoral studies in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Sears is considered by many as the world authority on the psychological care and quality of life outcomes of patients with implantable cardiodefibrillator patients. He has published well over 150 articles in the medicine and psychology research literatures and provides lectures all over the world on a regular basis. Thank you, and Dr. Sears, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hessen. What a pleasure to be here tonight. I wish I could only wish I could be in Philadelphia with you tonight. But we'll take it this way in our COVID era. We'll start out tonight with Inspector Gadget. Cartoons of yesteryear made a joke out of how difficult it was to live with multiple devices. We got used to the sort of shenanigans of living with multiple devices from Inspector Gadget. But our cardiac patients face a much more challenging multiple device experience as they manage advancing heart disease or advancing heart failure. The very nature of living with cardiovascular disease and then implementing cardiac devices seamlessly and effectively is a challenge our patients often have never faced anything similar. ICDs, LVADs, wearable defibrillators, loop recorders, new therapies like BAT therapy and wireless pacemakers, all part of the picture of our patients now in very much the inspector-patient gadget. Their engagement with these devices comes with a challenge that we want to look at tonight. So my goal for us tonight is to inspect cardiac devices, to have a look at what is it that our patients seek as we take care of them and utilize devices to somehow affect their mortality or morbidity. Look at the psychologic and behavioral aspects of living with heart disease, and then finally get to some clinical applications for this kind of research area. And then I hopefully challenge me with some good questions toward the end, and I'll leave time to make sure that we have that opportunity. The very idea of our patients monitoring themselves is a horse out of the barn. Our patients already are actively monitoring various aspects of their body with or without our awareness. Now, of course, this is a little overboard, but our patients also are involved in research trials. Here's a toilet seat that even measures our patient's weight. And so, in fact, this idea of monitoring things maybe has gone a little too far with the toilet seat. I don't know. That's up to you guys to consider, but clearly that's innovative, right? That's one I hadn't thought of. But what we have thought of is that the challenges do exist for our patients, that it's very much a modern day patient challenge. That today, a cardiac patient's challenge with living with the disease, which they've always been involved in, accepting these devices and minimizing the distress of both. Because our patients live longer, they have to cope longer, and these challenges become real. Well, some might say, well, let's get some more devices because maybe that would give us peace of mind. And most of you know already that the Apple Watch and other innovations have brought new challenges to every day in electrophysiology and in cardiology in general. But interestingly, there is no regulatory process or even a clue about the psychologic impact of such devices. We actually stand in very much the dark about whether these devices help or hurt our patients psychologically. We recently completed a small trial to demonstrate what our ICD patients may experience by simply using a smartphone-enabled ECG on a daily basis. In this study, we took 51 patients and said, hey, every day for a month, we want you to monitor your ECG and run a strip and send it to us. And in fact, our patients did that very well. They averaged 36 readings, so they pretty much followed our advice spot on. And what they said was, using standardized measures, they were satisfied, they were comfortable, and they thought it was important at high rates. And they even said, look, I kind of like this, and I understand my ICD a little bit better now that this thing uses a similar kind of algorithm. But like anything powerful enough to help, it's powerful enough to hurt. Because at the same time they reported that this kind of insight into their heart helped them, they also reported more shock anxiety over that course of time. So basically, one way to think about this is that our patients with ICDs benefited and became more familiar with their EKG, but they also became more aware that if that EKG is abnormal, that it has the supposed or potential relationship to shock. And so they became more anxious. So on the one hand, it benefited. On the other, it produced some anxiety. It was not simply all good or all bad, but simply the aspects of both positive and negative. Inspector Gadget could not simply walk away with an answer, but rather some challenges. And part of the reason that there's challenges is our patients deal with more than simply this disease, that there's an interrelationship in the clinical management of our heart patients with psychologic distress, the presence of a disease, the engagement with drugs and devices, various rehabilitative demands, and finally disengagement as a problem. Research into examining how challenging it is for our patients to live with the various diseases. Here's a study that compared heart failure to pulmonary disease and stage 4 cancer and tried to ask the question, what's the hardest to deal with? Well, as you can see, that the illnesses were comparable in quality of life. But when you focus in on anxiety, the heart failure patients reported statistically significant worse anxiety than pulmonary and cancer, and depression was worst for heart failure and pulmonary. Consistently then, our patients with heart failure had more challenges than even cancer. But if you step back and think about any of our hospitals, most of our cancer institutes have sufficient psychologic, social work, psychiatric care really on hand, but very few cardiac institutes do. And so this challenge is real for our patients, and our systems aren't always built for it. What about the other challenges of demands? Well, we have multiple studies now out in the last year or two. 42% of our patients reporting 10 or more medications daily. Most of us see that as a success, but nonetheless, there's demands on them. Their adherence is questionable. They're involved in multiple behaviors to manage their disease. And finally, we know something about their activity, all of which I'm going to go much more in depth in as we look at these data tonight. So this relationship of distress and disease, we're going to look at and have a look at. What are the psychologic considerations? What's all this distress that I speak of? Well, one of the reasons is because our patients are seeking some degree of psychologic acceptance. And we know Maslow's hierarchy was a theory about how patients and how all of us seek to become all we can be. And food, water, and shelter and Starbucks were, of course, the survival necessary needs. But right above that's the need for security, the sense that one is safe to go about their life. And then and only then, though, can we pursue these other sort of psychologic niceties. Well, another way to say that is then one of our patients in cardiology seek for us to prevent premature death with devices and medications. But the second important idea from this theory would be that we need to produce a feeling of security. That without the production of security in the face of threat, it is silly to pursue quality of life. It is silly to believe that our interventions are going to be well accepted by our patients if they are frightened by the eventuality of their disease. So much so that if you ask heart failure patients, hey, why are you sick? Why did this happen? And you can see some of these, like 11% say, I don't have any idea. Yeah, and somewhere between, and they can check more than one. 46% say, yeah, blood pressure might have been a part of it. 38, yeah, probably didn't take very good care of myself. But a third say that psychologic stress was the cause of heart failure. I'm not in that camp. I know some of you may say, well, it probably has some contribution. We could certainly discuss that, but the point being that our patients believe that to be so, that psychologically they believe that their own mental health somehow caused the disease. And now, of course, with COVID, we have yet another stressor on top of our patients. So collectively, our patients are dealing with a lot. And I would argue that the purpose of a cardiac visit today, whether remote or in person, is to reestablish that we are building safety nets to support our patients. That Inspector Gadget needs a safety net and that the equipment and the devices that he uses are there to create a safety net. So let's talk about the psychologic aspects of this. Whether we're talking about any of the various cardiac devices, I would argue the purpose of a cardiac device is to create security. But the full benefit is lost too often in our clinics when we don't get more psychologic buy-in. We leave benefit on the table. That if you're willing to accept that psychologic security is an essential building block, then devices must play a role in that. I like this guy with this tattoo, right? This is a sweet tat, man. I could bust this one. But specifically, look at this tat. It's neither all good or all bad. I mean, this guy's clearly proud of his device. It's right over his nipple. Looks like it's right about where the device might be. He's got some sort of funky engineering going on inside the device there. But look, it's also a tank. So at the same time, it's reassuring because he's got that tank. Tanks are violent. And when you think about anxiety for our patients, fear of exercise, fear of their heart beating fast are the most significant anxieties. You'll see a lot of studies that look at sort of stress and anxiety in our heart patients, but what is it about that stress and anxiety? Well, it does appear to be that fear of exertion. That kinesiophobia is the term, in case you ever see that on a crossword puzzle. But also, if you look at heart failure, of course, being short of breath, being exhausted, being fearful. Again, top concerns, top goals for our patients with heart failure. And if you look at chronic disease, our patients trying to feel safe are also trying to do some things to manage this disease. Theories about chronic disease have consistently demonstrated these three elements of chronic disease management. Of course, medical management, no duh. Emotional management, yeah, most people would accept that. But importantly, role management. Helping patients get back to doing as much as possible of their previous roles. And that turns out to be a behavioral idea that I want to get at as we look forward at some data. We know if you look at management models of self-care related to heart failure, I'll pay attention first to the blue long rectangle, that confidence is necessary across time to both maintain euvolemia, but also then manage it if it gets out of hand, from red to green there. And so these are skills that are just not common. Barbara Riegel from UPenn, one of your colleagues there, has emerged with this model. And I think it's a good one because it simply highlights the multiple skills necessary for our heart patients as they engage in this disease. You know, consumerism tells us it's easy, right? Here, I took this picture at the Apple store recently. Upgrade your heart health starting at $299. That's all you got to do. Yeah, forget about quitting smoking. Just get one of these watches. You're good. So, you know, the idea of quick hits are out there, but it turns out this is a little bit harder, right? It's not as easy as plug and play, right? We can't implant quality of life. We can't get you to wear quality of life. It's not plug and play. That instead, it's much more like wear and care or treat and meet. Right, I started coming up with silly ones, but you got the idea that this idea of engaging our patients over time is important. And we have the daily double in clinic every day. We have both psychologic distress and the need for behavioral change. If you look at our patients across cardiology, you know, 1 out of 4 of our heart patients are consistently reporting anxiety and depression. So we have a comorbidity that masquerades in cardiac clinic in at least 25% of our patients. It may masquerade, it may not tell you with wet tears, but our patients are fearful, our patients are dealing with significant distress, and it often goes unaddressed if we don't understand how to manage it better. Well, what do we know about it? I mean, depression's common, but it's not just that it's common. It's not just that it's masquerading. It's also a nuisance variable to the outcomes that you're interested in. That depression, anxiety interrupts and undermines high quality care and reduces the outcomes. Here's an example. Jarzma did this nice study of a European sample with almost 1,000 patients going through a heart failure disease management program. And they showed that, yes, it was a highly effective program. But they also showed that 37% had significant depression. And the only known predictor of the treatment not working, the multidisciplinary care not working, was in fact elevated depression scores. that depression did seem to simply take out the quality, the value, the active ingredients of multidisciplinary care. Our research has been entirely focused on the ICD patient and about how distress presents itself. As you look across the first three rows, you'll see a traditional psychiatric and psychologic syndromes, right? And they'll be in the ballpark of 25 to 33% across those common psychiatric and psychologic conditions. But those are typically referred conditions. The conditions that I think are equally and ably addressed in cardiac clinic are things like shock anxiety. How much our patients are worrying about shock. If you ask a patient, what's the chances you think you're going to get shocked? Almost all of them will say 50-50. 50-50? No, that's not the chances of being shocked. No, it's not. That our patients, typically 4 to 6% across an annual year, have a risk of shock. But they'll say, no, I think I'm highly likely. These are patients who are obviously overly concerned about shock, even though shock is a legitimate contender here. Avoidance of activity. Our patients avoid activity at high rates. I'm going to show some data on that. And then finally, our patients have poor understanding of ICD. Actually, even studies looking at hospitalists and healthcare providers have very poor understanding about how arrhythmias are detected by the device, how they're treated by the device. In fact, there's a degree of avoidance of learning about devices out of some of the nuances that devices represent. The good news is, psychologically, our patients can be categorized. That is, the risk is not uniform. Our patients who are less than 50 years of age are much more likely to be distressed across all of our cardiovascular clinics, regardless of severity, regardless of diagnostic type. Being less than 50 is the single best predictor of psychologic distress in our heart patients. You can see some of the other ones. Of course, patients with previous problems, patients exposed to high numbers of shocks, patients who are isolated or lonely, patients who don't understand their device, they don't do as well. Over on the resilient side, factors that seem to help our patients, I would highlight faith in ICD and doctor. Because why? In my view, that is a marker for security, that patients feel safer with a medical team and an understanding of a device that's there to protect them. So in my view, that's consistent with this idea of, can we create security in the face of threat? Now, that's a value proposition. But behavioral change is also necessary. We can't simply just reassure our patients. We've got to do more. We've got to find ways to help them manage these diseases better. And in my view, electrophysiology and cardiology in general is moving in that direction. We've seen it in the recent documents from ESC and HRS on atrial fib, that behavioral management is increasingly important. Well, what do we know about it? In heart failure, we know that adherence is more the norm than not. While this study was quite encouraging related to medication non-adherence, only 10%, most other studies would suggest it's closer to a third or a half of our patients are non-adherent to medicines. Nonetheless, in this longitudinal study looking at a large sample of heart failure patients, you can see the rates of non-adherence, medication being the lowest, but all the way down to exercise, where we see 73% of our patients getting little to no exercise, and we'll look at that even closer. But look at that, alcohol, right? Smoking, still 25% of our patients smoking. So behavioral change is not enough. Doctor's advice is not enough. We're going to have to find strategies and referrals and ways to facilitate that in our patients. My research has been particularly focused on activity of late, and it's because activity seems to have a robust physical and mental health return on investment. We have a couple of studies to highlight here before we talk about our most recent. So if you just give ACS patients a Fitbit and say, here's a Fitbit, go live. I want you to try to get 150 minutes of activity a week. Well, in this study where they just gave people Fitbits, 16% of our patients were able to achieve that level of exercise after discharge. So 84%, of course, could not. And the reasons they said they couldn't, those who did not said, I'm afraid to exercise. I'm afraid my heart will give out. And a third said, how can you ask me to do this? You know, I've had a heart attack. I'm depressed. I don't feel like I'm safe. I don't feel like the future is positive. In research into ICD patients, meta-analytic studies, including HF Action and some other large-scale exercise-based studies, meta-analysis, though, has specifically indicated that ICD patients do, in fact, benefit from cardiac exercise or cardiac fitness. They improve on VO2 max and other sort of physiologic parameters. Interestingly, there appears to be an antiarrhythmic effect to exercise. So the very protective response that our ICD patients often do by disengaging from exercise is the opposite of a protective response. It actually increases their chances of being shocked. This is convincing evidence when you start to look at the large-scale nature of this meta-analysis with thousands of patients now enrolled in these kinds of trials. And now we'll talk about our recent work around implantable defibrillator patients, where we'll try to blend this idea of anxiety and activity and what it's all about. In this study, we looked at almost 3,000 patients with ICDs in 21 nations around the world. Because ICDs have an accelerometer that measures every minute of their activity level of the accelerometer inside their device, each minute is scored as either an active or an inactive minute. This particular brand device uses roughly a 15-second movement period of a minute to score an active minute. It's not exactly correct, but for the purposes of this discussion, a minute is granted if the patient moves for a continuous movement. And the idea here was, of course, related to the pacing functions of the device. We don't want to pace people for turning over in bed, so sustained movement is scored as an active minute. We followed patients for almost 2+ years, well, almost 2 years. And we specifically then had every minute of their life with a defibrillator as scored as an either active or inactive minute. We had shock anxiety, that is their degree of fear about being shocked. And we had their EuroQol 5D scores, so their quality of life scores. And we asked the question, well, how much activity is normal? I mean, what should we be going for? What's average? And how does ICD shock change activity? So how does adversity change activity? And then what about anxiety? How does it play into this? So the first question was, how active is the average ICD patient around the world? Well, in the largest study that'll probably ever be conducted looking at this, the average amount of activity around the world by an ICD patient was 3 hours and 5 minutes a day. Even graded on the curve, the average patient around the world is sedentary, still 21 hours a day. This surprised me. And while we don't have norms for non-ICD patients around the world, 3 hours of activity a day, I think under any metric is pretty low. Again, movement, not activity even, movement, only 3 hours and 5 minutes a day. So what happens if ICD patients encounter a shock? So here we have 249 patients who were ultimately shocked. And we can look at their actigrams back 90 days before a shock on the far left to 90 days after a shock on the far right. You see the 185 minutes of activity across the dotted line, so 3 hours and 5 minutes. And you can see that over the course of 90 days prior to a shock, they were roughly in the average range. But as you'll note, as they approach that day of shock, there does appear to be a slight dip, and then the day of shock occurs, and you see they move from about 185 minutes a day down to below 120 minutes a day, less than 2 hours a day. And it takes about 3 months for them to return toward the 185-minute mark. So 90 days is the short answer. How long will it take me to get back on the horse, doc? It's roughly 90 days if you do nothing. We certainly would encourage you to do more than that. But if you do nothing, it's 90 days. Okay, well, what about some other things? What about shock anxiety? So here we have the curve from 0 to 24 months of activity, or of shock anxiety in this group of patients. The blue group is the group that never did get shocked. The red group is the group that eventually got shocked by some means. And what you'll see from day 0 to 6 months is that all patients are anxious early on, that over the course of 3 to 6 months, things get back to normal. And if unshocked, they continue for over 2 years of essentially an average shock anxiety. But if the patient is shocked, they move to the red group, and you can see that it's an elevated level and stays elevated for almost 2 years follow-up. So while activity may resume back to the 3 hours and 5 minutes, anxiety without any treatment appears to persist for quite some time. Again, vertebrates don't like electricity, so not surprising our patients are slow to respond to that. Now, a couple other studies that give us some insights into activity. Here's a study we recently completed with wearable defibrillator patients. These were patients who wore the vest at high rates, so almost 23 hours a day. And we looked at 2,000, all the patients in, I think it was the year 2017, we had every patient who wore a vest at high rates during that year. And what we showed was the median number of steps from the point of wearing a vest to 90 days was 5,568 steps. I think this surprised us. This was higher than we would have thought. Women wore the vest more, but moved less. A different way to look at this data is that our younger patients were quite a bit more active. You can see the ages are across the bottom, the median steps across the y-axis. And so you see that our younger patients were more active, but even as you get out to the 60s, people are in the 5,000 range, which is pretty good as an average median, that is a median number of steps. And this, of course, our patients can appreciate much more than the accelerometer and the implantable device. This is a more intuitive metric of movement. But even more importantly than activity is, does activity have some prognostic value? Here, in a study of 4,000 wearable defibrillator patients from the year 2018, here you see that we were able to plot the number of steps by the presence of a shock in a wearable defibrillator patient. And here what we showed was that less than 3,637 steps on average or on median per day was associated with being shocked. That is a 5 times greater likelihood of being shocked if our patients walk less than 3,637 steps. Now, clearly there is a comorbidity here. There's a confound, and our sicker patients aren't able to move. But there's also patients who are fearful, don't feel safe, and for whatever reason believe that self-protection, that using their device to simply sit on the sidelines is good enough for their recovery. So the data's mounting in terms of how our devices can tell us about how our patients are behaving and how our devices can produce the kind of security or safety that we want them to have. Our model, when you send patients to someone like me, the model of any cardiac event that arouses a patient's anxiety level, I tend to pay attention to those 3 red boxes. The extent to which our patients are sort of catastrophizing, like if I give myself exercise, my heart's just going to blow up. That's catastrophizing. Or the patient who says, well, I absolutely cannot go see a football game. I am going to sit at home. In fact, I'm not going to watch the Eagles because it's going to make me so mad. I'm going to just disengage. And I'm not going to go walk or do anything. I'm going to stay home. And in fact, what I'm going to do while I'm home is use my device to be hypervigilant about my EKG. I'm going to stay at home and monitor myself. That way I'll keep myself safe. I'll protect myself by being a full-time patient. These are the challenges our patients face. So when we think about this problem, then, what should we do about it? How do we get from this information set to some sort of active set that we can use in clinic even tomorrow? Well, I'm going to suggest that we stay with our framework I suggested earlier about medical management, role management, and emotional management. That to really think about the empathic viewpoint of our patients is to look about what are the challenges in each of these spheres and see if we can make a little dent on it with a brief clinical encounter. Well, first is the idea of medical management, right? Successful medical management is an achievement, not an entitlement. That we challenge our patients to say, okay, yeah, I know you're frightened, but this is an opportunity to write a comeback story. That you and your family have the challenge here to make a comeback. to return to the greatest level of functioning possible, even with some limitations. That comeback, that cardiac comeback, is what we seek together. You and I share that goal, and let's go after it together. But to do that, we've got to have some standard operating procedures. I've got to know that you have a plan to take those medicines as we've prescribed them. I need to know that you know exactly what to do with this device. If it's an implantable defibrillator, do you know exactly what to do if you were shocked? If it's a remote monitoring, do you know exactly how to do that? Related to your activity, we expect you to be moving. We can monitor that with our devices. In terms of quality of life, what do you love to do? When are you going to get back to it? And finally, expectations. What is your thoughts about the future? What frightens you about the future? What are you hopeful about the future? These kinds of standard operating procedures, they're quick, they engage our patients in participating. Because the patients face challenges, right? A cigarette in one hand, a Fitbit in the other. They're working at this, right? This is a difficult medical management plan at times. Finally, next, or role management. So taking action prompts change in attitude. Rather than try to cheerlead them into change, I think one of the best ways to move forward based on research is simply, where can we start with a change? What's a small change that you can make to create some positive forward motion? What are the things in the past you were successful at changing? What did you enjoy about those changes? And what's been blunted? What are you not doing that you were doing before? It's very unlikely that what you were doing before is somehow now prohibited. And finally, where are we trying to get? What are the goals? That shared goal setting turns out to be one of the active ingredients. Now, our devices, Inspector Gadget has devices, so we can look at patient activity level. This particular printout shows a patient with pretty much modest activity over time. It's like, man, nothing's really changed. But if you look carefully, the patient is active less than 2 hours a day. Yeah, they haven't changed much, but their overall activity rate is far below the mean of 3 hours and 5 minutes a day. Similarly, with a wearable defibrillator, here we have activity steps. We even have body position. And here we have similar kinds of variability of activity over time that we can help our patients see that, yes, we are monitoring, that our attentiveness to patient activity via devices provides a new insight into what our patients are doing. Our daily roles create activity, and so do planned physical activity. And if our patients can't do physical activity, I focus more on what are the things you do toward your own self-care, and we'll detect those with accelerometer as well. Finally, emotional management, which many of you thought, oh, that's what he's going to talk the most about. Well, here I want to suggest the psychologic principle that is broadly derived from the research literature about how all of us cope. Most of us underrate our ability to cope and overrate the impact of problems. So if I had told you 5 years ago that we would all be in a pandemic in 2020 and that we would shut down our hospitals, we would have a significant mortality rate, we would freak out. But yet we've all lived through that very serious health pandemic and continue to live through it, of course. And one of the things then that means is we can often talk with our patients and tell them about, you already know how to cope. It's just time to be more deliberate in taking care of yourself. That as you recover from this hard event, being more deliberate about how you spend your time with your family, how you spend your time in self-care, how you spend your time in activity is part of the process of getting better. We've written a lot about this. We have all kinds of free handouts out there regarding how to live confidently with heart disease or atrial fib. These are available in the journal Circulation and in other journals where we've written about how to do that. But that generally involves, from a cardiac clinic perspective, what I call deliberate reassurance and deliberate re-engagement. That is, we must be deliberate in saying, I know this has been hard, but you are coping. Rather than just cheer them up, really talk about, how are you keeping yourself going? That's impressive. And then how are you going to get back in the swing of things? That just like my research that showed that anxiety was persistent, but behavior returned, these two elements of behavior and reassurance are essential. And knowing about confidence, knowing about how people feel safe, how they get active, and how they get engaged, these three elements are part of the emotional management. While our emotionally distressed patients are disengaged, helping them in small changes appears to be the best way to kind of get them moving and get some behavioral momentum. Finally, most of the things that we see in cardiac clinic can be addressed as we find ways to sort of encourage them and show them small ways to make changes, but some can't. This is a slide to just simply remind you that there are patients who need to be referred for psychiatric and psychologic care, such that patients who are highly fearful, that is, they have psychologic activity restrictions, things like, I can't go see my grandkids, I'll get too emotional. Patients who have, self-harm thoughts, they need to be referred. Patients who are wearing out their welcome in your clinic, the high utilizers, are probably seeking something more emotionally than you can provide. And patients with low quality of life that are disengaged need something more than simply standard operating procedures in cardiac clinic. The history of mankind has involved the idea of somehow harnessing both heart and mind. Cardiac devices begin this process for us in the modern era. Cardiac devices provide us information about behavior and cardiac function that may also be a proxy for how our patients are psychologically accommodating the experiences of heart disease and the management and the treatment considerations that we're engaging them in. Comprehensive quality care plus technology can, in fact, produce the kind of desirable health outcomes that we want. And when we do that, we go beyond Inspector Gadget. We go to a confident Inspector Gadget, Inspector Patient Gadget, who's able to cope very well. Thanks very much.
Dr. Sears, that was absolutely wonderful. I appreciate everything you said. Great presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Robert Schaller from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also one of the CVI EP Arrhythmia Management Program Directors. First, I'd just like to thank Dr. Sears for that. What an incredible talk. So unique, so practical. Just really one of the best talks I've heard in a long time. So thank you. And
very nice. Thank you.
On all your work. So I have the honor of moderating a Q&A session with Dr. Sears, and Dr. Hessen will join me. And so we'll wait for a couple of questions from the audience, but I think I'll start out. I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So Icd support groups used to be present in most major cities, but they, at least from what I've seen, they seem to be a thing of the past. So a lot of patients that we've seen, particularly the younger patients with inappropriate shocks, every year there are a handful of patients who ask for something like this. So where would you refer a patient like that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. The support groups were a great avenue for that. I still think there's room for them. I think they're more along the lines of like a patient celebration, kind of an annual meeting, bringing in a speaker. I still do a number of those around the country, and others, mental health professionals as well, do them. There is a room for them. They're just fewer and farther between. So the alternative, I think, is to identify a mental health provider in your area and sort of bring them out of the cold. Bring them into clinic and let them see a cardiac clinic functioning if they're not familiar. I think looking for people who are called health psychologists. So clinical health psychologists are people who are trained in medical schools and trained in and around physicians so that they understand the sort of wear and tear on patients and doctors that are managing psych factors. I do think that I was sort of teasing about bringing them out of the cold. Mental health providers really benefit from coming and seeing a clinic, and just the firsthand experience of being with you and saying, look, here's a patient who is encountering, occasionally passing out, and it's driving them nuts. Here's a patient who's experiencing PVCs, but the patient is safe, but the PVCs are driving them nuts. Here's a patient who had an inappropriate shock, and now they don't trust their device like they should. So those are all, sensitive things that you're running into. And I think any mental health provider who has some experience with that, even if you bring them into the picture, I think can really assist with that. psychologists are particularly good at helping people manage chronic disease. So much so that when you look at the sleep literature or the chronic pain literature, there's pretty good evidence that behavioral therapy is better than the pharmacologic first reach meds that everybody reaches for, that are household names. But it takes a little bit of effort on the patient side and the right provider.
That's great. We have a bunch of questions starting to come in now, so we'll try to get through them here. So the first question is, do you use a standard quality of life tool with your patients? And how do you go about distributing these forms or surveys to your patients?
Yeah, great question. So I'm completely biased. I have something called the Florida Shock Anxiety Scale, which we created at the University of Florida, and the Florida Patient Acceptance Scale. Both of these are free. I can send them to you. There is no profiteering whatsoever. They're free. They're easy to score. In clinic, we use them. The Shock Anxiety Scale is particularly good because what we're trying to often do is separate, is this patient just generally anxious, neurotic, if you will, versus has a cardiac specific anxiety. And that's where I really want to separate those two things as much as possible. I do not want cardiologists chasing around Woody Allen trying to make him less anxious. But I do want cardiologists, if Woody Allen's got a defibrillator, I want Woody to understand the chances of being shocked, what to do if shocked, and the recovery of shock. I want Woody, the day after he's stabilized, we change his device, put him on amio, whatever it is we do, I want him up and at him, even if it's slow and moving. He's got to move or he's going to develop fear. I mean, it reminds me of the person after a knee surgery that decides they won't move their knee. It will not work. I mean, it's a physical, psychologic therapy, right? So it's the same kind of thing. So I use device-based tools the most. I use a Beck depression inventory, a PHQ-9 sometimes, and a GAD-7. So it's simple stuff, free stuff. I don't think that making money on tools is the right thing to do. These are all the promise measures. There are different measures out there. They're all free. Your system, probably your Epic stupid system, makes you screen some of these tools. I mean, they pay you a nickel if you run them, if you give them. I mean, it's sort of silly, but so there are tools out there. I think the key though is if you have a tool, do something with the results. So right now, there's too often it's like, well, they screen positive for depression. I hope they don't have it anymore. Well, that's kind of not a solution, right?
Yeah. So Dr. Sears, I have a question while we're waiting for some others, and that is that I haven't really paid a lot of attention to the activity logs of these devices. I mean, obviously we look for arrhythmias and function and battery and all that stuff.
Yes.
But the activity logs, I think that what you presented is very interesting. And so my question is, would a activity log that suggests chronically low activity below the median value of 180 minutes or whatever, in somebody who you feel physically should be able to do more, would that be a reasonable thing to send that patient to cardiac rehab?
Yes.
Beyond the psychology support?
Well, I would send them to cardiac rehab first.
Okay.
So and if they don't have a qualifying diagnosis, then I would give them a walking program. And if they don't want to do that, then I would bring them in for treadmill tests a couple times to get them used to exposing themselves to the fear. It is basically a natural laboratory of reducing fear by getting people to exert themselves.
Okay.
And I can't tell you how often I benefit in taking care of a patient when the cardiologist has said, I want you to be physically active, not just you're safe to do whatever you want. Okay, well, whatever I want is to drink mocha frappuccinos and watch football all day, every day, and do nothing. So I think being explicit about, I'm expecting you to get 30 minutes a day of activity. I'm expecting you to walk. I want you to walk your dog, your neighbor, your wife. I don't care, but I want you out and moving. I think that's really important. Now, in your defense, Dr. Hessen, we haven't had good data about what's normal. Our research is really the first to try to set out what's average. What should these patients even be doing? Because we have this strange metric of device detected movement. So the only other markers I would have is, the data from the Women's Health Initiative tells us we need to be at about 4,400 steps for health, all the way up to 7,500. Our wearable defibrillator data suggests that it needs to be over 3,000. So I like to use 4,400 steps if the patient's messing with numbers and all that stuff as sort of the mark. I'm sort of surprised how well they do, how fast. I'm also surprised at how low they start. So, like if you start monitoring our patients, it's like, oh, they get 2,000 steps a day. But then you say, well, let's get going. And pretty soon they're at 5, 6, 7. They love it. I mean, they feel better. So no shame or guilt on not looking at it on the device because there hasn't been any good data. All you can look is relative. Now we have some absolute that says 3 hours and 5 minutes. If you're below that, you're just, I mean, this is minuscule. We also have pediatric data, and the pediatric data is quite a bit better. It's closer to 5 hours of movement. I have a study with 1,900 kids, 0 to 17. Well, I think it's like 3 to 17. 1,900 devices. The average moves up closer to 5 hours a day. So there does appear to be room to move here. By the way, right at about 14 years of age, the kids go to about 3 hours and 5 minutes.
I love that, looking at the same data we've been looking at, but in a new and a very novel way. That's very exciting.
Yeah, and I do want to highlight this pediatric thing because it's sort of like, oh my gosh, right? I mean, basically, even in our ICD patients, we see this sort of the teenage years, they flatten out. Then they act like us.
Yeah, speaking of teenagers, so this is similar to the support group question I asked, but this is maybe more appropriate for the modern times. The next question is with what about social networking solutions for some support for some patients?
That's a great question. We have published on that. We actually looked at a large sample of Facebook and website users with ICDs, and we did show that the average patient who's tapping on those focus or those Facebook accounts had clinically significant levels of shock anxiety. So those are distressed patients out there. They are out there and they are online. So proceed with caution, right? So there is support out there, but there's support from people who are also pretty anxious. There's a role for it. I just worry a little bit about the sort of cross-contamination. I got 5 shocks because I put ketchup on my hot dog. Whatever the inappropriate attribution of shock. So stay away from ketchup. Heinz is really bad for you. Whatever the thing. I mean, we hear crazy stuff, right? And so be careful out there on the internet. So I try to send them to websites I think I can trust. I've got a couple of different ones I use. I'd be happy to send those to anybody who wants that. I'll send my measures. Anybody can find me easily at sears@ecu.edu. I'll send you whatever. I've got more papers than sense.
So you're saying maybe avoid Reddit for your ICD information.
Yeah, I would say probably Reddit's a little scary out there, but actually, we actually had an ICD Facebook group that we were pursuing. And I can't remember the sample size, but it was pretty decent. It was a couple of hundred, if I remember. And we used those same tools that we use in clinic, and yeah, it was like a clinical sample.
An interesting. One of the participants asked a follow-up question, maybe having some sort of support chain with a mid-level provider providing some tech support or some sort of communication in that fashion. Maybe that's something to consider in the future.
Yeah, and we do see that with the younger groups. Mike Ackerman at Mayo is actually the president of one of the groups, Sudden Cardiac Arrest Association, and so we do have those are out there. They kind of hit and miss, come and go, but I mean the internet is not silent. There's some stuff out there, but nothing organized.
The last question is, I think you probably touched upon this when you talked about bringing psychologists in from the cold. How do you suggest we help patients with psychological care in areas where there aren't too many people familiar with cardiovascular problems? Maybe you do have to bring them into your clinic or create some sort of team effort there to get someone involved.
Yeah, if there's no mental health providers, and we certainly have rural areas here in North Carolina and in Florida where I lived before. So a couple things there. Education is number one, like teach them, coach them up, get some materials. There's lots of them out there. I've written a bunch of them. There are other people who write about them. Second thing is use behavior. Focus on the frightened patient activity level. Put them on a treadmill test. Not for the diagnostics of the treadmill test, but for the exposure of their heart beating faster. That's what they're afraid of. It's like a fear. It's like a pebble in a pond. The fear is death and shock, but it has a concentric set of anxieties that come out from that include elevated heart rate, include activities. And so when we break down some of those barriers, we can reduce some of the anxiety. And I think just empathy. I think mature respect for the challenges our patients face. Those things go a long way if there's no mental health. And then ultimately, if necessary, referral to the big city or perhaps online. But as I said, cautiously.
I have one final question. Perhaps Scott has another. This is kind of a niche question and pertinent to my practice, but you're the perfect person to ask. I found that some patients like to know that they can hide their ICD generator, and we put it under the pectoralis muscle. They like not knowing it's there, it's hidden, and they don't worry about it more. And maybe that's underutilized in certain areas. Maybe people don't think about it or don't even know that might be something that you could do. Perhaps that's an area for study, or at least something to think about.
Yeah, and one of my former graduates actually did an outcome study in Iowa on that very thing, a subpectoral approach. And patients did, in fact, report high levels of acceptance, particularly women, particularly young patients. They really liked that idea of making it bikini friendly, if you will. And I think that's a place. Most EPs I know don't like it because it's a pain in the butt to get in and out of there. But for the right patient, that is something that's a small modicum of control that probably produces significant psychological benefit. And we have some evidence of that. There is some statistical evidence that, in fact, it would do the very thing you suspect, and that is help patients feel like they're part of the team.
I'm going to look that up. I think that's underutilized. So, Scott, if you don't have any more questions, I think that's all the questions from the audience. So I just wanted to thank Dr. Sears again. This is really one of my favorite talks in a long time. So unique. I'm really looking forward to the next one. Before concluding tonight, we'd like to thank our dedicated industry partners who have provided educational grants and exhibits for tonight's program. Please remember later this month, CVI's 27th annual cardiology update, clinical management of heart disease with, look at these keynotes, Eugene Braunwald and Milton Packer. So it doesn't get much better than that. Please visit our website, cviphiladelphia.org for details and to register. And thank you again. Thank you to Dr. Sears. Thank you to all the participants, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.